Okay. Hello. Okay, so I want to start by asking the question, what is Talmudic theology? What would this even look like? What is Jewish philosophy? What's going on? Like, how can we do this? And if we do this, what should it be based on? And my starting point is the essay by Eliezer Berkovits, What is Jewish Philosophy? So to maybe just kind of introduce the stage, Eliezer Berkovits, he was a rabbi. He learned with some of the great Talmudists of the 20th century, and he was also had a very strong, academic interest in philosophy, what we now call it Jewish thought, and so that's kind of his perspective. So in this essay, he starts off, correcting a basic error that is quite common. The basic error is, what is Jewish philosophy or Jewish thought? It's stuff that Jews think. How do you define people as being Jewish? Well, as you may know, the traditional definition of who is Jewish is someone whose mother is Jewish. And that means that this person could, later in their life, say they no longer believe in the Torah or God or anything at all. And they would still be Jewish. They would be invited to return to the faith, no matter what they do. And so a result of this line of thinking would be that Spinoza is a Jewish thinker. Okay. And on the flip side, you can go take an opposite approach. Opposite approach would be, let's say you're reading, Rav Sadia Gaon or Maimonides, the Rambam. Let's say you're reading, the Guide to the Perplexed, and you're seeing all this, call it philosophy based on Aristotle in the Arabic tradition, the cosmological, logical arguments for the creation of the universe by one God in the Islamic world. They're called the Kalam. And you could say, this isn't Jewish. This is, foreign knowledge, philosophy. It's not Judaism. Now okay. So, but Berkovits, writing in 1961, he says, a resurgent national pride in our own days is only too willing to claim as Jewish the achievements of any great man of Jewish descent. And so just as the spineless assimilationism of the past generations was only too anxious to disclaim characteristic marks of Jewishness whenever it could be done with the least semblance of plausibility. So, for example, you could have people who say, well, I don't like Judaism or being Jewish. And so if there are thinkers in the past that I want to spot, like Maimonides, Cited, I'll say, well, they were really great, Arabic logicians. That's much more respectable than being a Jewish thinker. Okay. And so he says, people included Henry Bergson in a survey of Jewish philosophy. Henry Bergson, probably a smart guy, probably a very good guy, but Eliezer Berkovits is putting his hand on the problem and saying, what's Jewish about his thought? Okay? And this could become very general. You could say, what's Jewish about anything, really? And he says, if you think Henry Bergson's thought is Jewish, putting aside it could be useful to someone doing, let's say, some kind of authentic Jewish reflection on our faith, but what he's doing, it's empty of content from a Jewish perspective. If you think it's Jewish just because he's Jewish, is a sign of emotional coarseness and intellectual confusion. So we have to make ourselves unconfused. And Eliezer Berkovits, in this essay, is setting out a way we can unconfuse ourselves just by finding a proper grounding. So it says, no doubt, a case may be made for the Jewish elements in the thought of Spinoza, and even in that of Bergson. Okay, because you can find parallels to anything, And everyone does have a certain basis that they start with. Like if you start off within one intellectual world and let's say you completely switch to another, you're still going to have traces, perhaps even in the negation of what you started off with, unless, I don't know, fast for 40 days repeatedly and completely empty your mind of whatever came before, some extreme thing. So he says, there can be no question that Maimonides was a Jewish philosopher, whereas the same thing will not be so readily affirmed by either Spinoza or Bergson. That's interesting. He just says there's no doubt. Okay, it's the 1960s. There's no doubt about these things. So, I mean, if we were to stop here, we could do something like, Rambam, Maimonides, he was trying to set out a system in which Judaism made sense. He was kind of trying to argue, you're not crazy. If you follow these principles, you should view the commandments in the Torah literally applying to you. You should actually not eat pork. You should actually keep Shabbat. You should actually, be part of the physical Jewish people that you find in, synagogues, that sort of thing. Whereas Spinoza and Bergson, they're much more general. I mean, you could say that they're trying to set out a series of philosophical truths that they're trying to argue for, but their goal, their ethical home run or end result is not predetermined to be like, hey, you need to follow the mitzvot in the Torah. And you could even critique Rambam if you're from this very, let's call it the philosophical side. You could say, what kind of good philosopher sets out with everything all predetermined? And, in any time you're listening to something or thinking about something, it's worth worrying to some degree to which everything's all predetermined. Like if you're reading Kant, a certain kind of logical, let's say within a very Christian worldview, results are all very predetermined. It's kind of baked into things. You can't just sit down and be like, I'm going to read Kant and we'll see what happens. We all kind of know what's going to happen. Do we want to talk about Ibn Gabirol? Well, I mean, Ibn Gabirol wrote some beautiful Hebrew poetry, absolutely wonderful stuff. So, so he's actually present in the monastic or the scholastic tradition, because his philosophical work was known in Latin as Fons Vitae, and his name was not Ibn Gabirol, it was Avi Sebron. Okay? So Avi Sebron, his work served as kind of textbook of Christian scholasticism, and no one read this and thought, oh, this is Ibn Gabirol, the brilliant Jew. In the middle of the 19th century, it was discovered that the mysterious Avi Sebron was the genius of Jewish poetry, Shlomo Ibn Gabirol. So what happened here? If you can have not just Jews, but pious Jews who are brilliant poets, so what happened here? So he says the truth is that the history of Jewish philosophy reflects the philosophies of all ages and of all lands in which the Jewish people lived and thought. So let's just kind of see what's going on here. Once you start using logical premises or embracing a system of logic created by humans, usually created by humans who aren't Jewish, by the way. Berkovits posits, perhaps correctly, that we enter into a kind of relativism, as in we're certain of religious truth, but how to express it in terms of the philosophies that we're aware of depends on the philosophies that we're aware of. Let's see where we can go with this. Philosophical inquiry is a human pursuit, and man is always time and place conditioned. So I think calling this relativism is pretty on point. Any Jew who ever attempts to give a philosophical account of Judaism cannot work with the philosophical equipment of his own times. He must make use of the tools of logic which are at hand, of the epistemological concepts and metaphysical ideas which are accessible to him. So, for example, let's take Rav Sadia Gaon. In the 10th century, set out to provide intellectual certitude for the traditional doctrines of Judaism. He could only do so by making use of the philosophy he knew. And many centuries later, in a German Kantian context, Hermann Cohen wrote his The Religion of Reason. And he had, of course, deep admiration for Moses Maimonides, but he could not be expected to offer a philosophy of Judaism in terms of the outdated categories of Aristotle. It was inescapable that he should use the terms of Kantianism, which he himself considered to be the valid philosophical system of the day. Okay, so it's kind of like saying, there was a philosophy 1.0, which is based on Aristotle. And if you were living in Kantianism, you'd view Kantianism as the 2.0, the update to the operating system. And of course you would update. Makes sense from that perspective. There's no return to Aristotle. First of all, it's Judaism, not Aristotle. So we are faced here with a paradoxical situation. The very ambition of the thinker to provide a true and convincing philosophy of Judaism makes his work always relative, i.e. temporal, and therefore of only passing validity. So this is getting to the heart of things. As in, let's say we enjoy theology, philosophy, because we like talking about lofty concepts, and it stirs the soul. Well, the moment we try to use the language of people, which is embedded in our time and place, the nature of our discourse becomes relative and time-bound and contextual to our time and place. And then you might say, okay, fine, that's fine. Let's do that. Okay, but what is it that we're doing? So he says, every thinker in the history of Jewish philosophy interpreted Judaism in the categories of thought of his own generation. All Jewish philosophies are subjective. They make sense in a certain time, in a certain situation, for certain people. They are always the words of men, not the word of God. Think about that. As in, what's the word of God? The word of God is the Torah. What does the Torah tell us? Definitely not some kind of systematic theology. Might have all the necessary material for an appropriate theology. What is the Talmud? Definitely not a work of systematic theology. Might have all the ingredients that you need for an appropriate theology. But to do that kind of interpretation and translation, to use any terms other than the original Hebrew and Aramaic, respectively, that's going to require a human mind to interpret and apply, in addition to it's kind of unmixing everything. Part 2. So he raises two questions here. If the Jewish philosopher applies contemporary method and concepts to the interpretation of Judaism, wherein lies the specific quality of his Jewishness? Okay? So, for example, I would like to think that if I sit down and I philosophize, I'm doing some Jewish philosophy. And I like to think that there are some people nowadays who, if they sit down and philosophize, they're not doing Jewish philosophy. They're actually less valid than than the thoughts of someone who's committed to practicing Judaism and advocating for it. And if you're not, you might have valid philosophical thoughts. I'm not here to disparage, But like you're not doing Jewish thought. You're doing something else. You should live and be well. But by what criteria do I say this? Listen, hoping that it's true doesn't make it true. Secondly, if we have maintained that all philosophies of Judaism are essentially subjective, and therefore of only passing validity, okay, as in the philosophical thoughts of Moses Maimonides, you should live and be well, Gesundheit, but eventually they will become antiquated relative to the modern philosophical thoughts. You're living in 19th century Germany, Kantianism is all the rage. You're living later in our age, you look at like the philosophy of Kripke, and he's made huge actual advances in how names relate or refer to, let's call them metaphysical entities. They do actually figure stuff out. They do update things. So, before anything else, there is a limiting factor that circumscribes the search and the efforts of the Jewish thinker, which all ages have in common. Okay, here we are. No Jewish thinker can ever start from the beginning. Judaism is always given when he starts his inquiry. Okay, so this means I can't start my inquiry and end up concluding we have to do Tibetan Buddhism and then still be a Jewish thinker. I say with a lot of respect, it's just that would be something else. That would be shelved somewhere else in the library. It would be different. You have to be on the Judaism shelf in the library. Descartes became the founder of modern philosophy by his decision to start anew, throwing overboard all acknowledged certainties and applying the method of the radical doubt. Okay, so you can disagree with Descartes, you can agree with Descartes, but he starts by saying, "There's all this stuff I don't know. I think, therefore I am." You can actually, and you can question. You can say, "How do you know that you are?" That's ridiculous. That assumes existence. Get off the road. And so what Descartes did is, Berkovits says, is this is the ideal method for all non-committed thinkers to follow. This, however, is the method that a Jewish thinker cannot adopt. We cannot start from zero and still be Jewish. The Jewish philosopher does not create Judaism as Descartes created modern philosophy. When he arrives on the scene, Judaism is already a given fact. Okay? Now, we kind of have to pause here a little bit reading through Berkovits. We have to ask, what are we doing here? Are we shooting arrows at the barn and then drawing the target around the arrows? Because we can do that, and that can be a logical demonstration of okay, here's how this works. But that doesn't prove that you can shoot the arrow. So his thinking always has a partner, Judaism. Well, what is Judaism? You have to ask this now. Is this an ideal Judaism that exists intellectually? Or is this, pardon me, not Judaism, but the religion of Jews? To take a more materialist lens, a la Feuerbach, that it's a kind of meaningless to talk about Judaism as an abstract ideal. But you can go to the synagogue, you can find Jews, you can talk to them, you can pray with them, and you can participate in that living religion. That's Judaism, the religion of actual physical Jews. So it is true, every philosophy of Judaism is essentially subjective. But this subjectivity is tempered, fenced in, and controlled by the factual givenness of Judaism itself, which forever confronts the Jewish philosopher. So we're not rootless cosmopolitans. We are Jews. We're connected to this eternal religion. So the path of the Jewish philosopher is determined by one element that is a variable, another that is a constant. The variable is the intellectual scholarly equipment that each thinker uses in building his own philosophy. Time-conditioned, contextual, subjective, and Berkovits emphasizes in this essay, passing. And if you work something out in this year, 100 years from now, it is expected that humans are going to come up with cleverer abstractions, and the house of cards that you build now will not remain standing. All these philosophies are the thoughts of men. They are Jewish because they attempt to render Judaism intellectually meaningful. And I might add, not just logically coherent, but there's a process called naturalization, where you take things that sound kind of abstract, and religious, and whatever, and like, okay, fine, and you say, actually, it's not so weird. It relates to things that you have an instinctual understanding for, that you can understand and have things correspond to. And making that move of naturalization, of just saying like, okay, like here are the concepts and ideas that we see in our lives, because we live in the year 2025, at least for a couple more days, and then it's going to be 2026. These concepts, these things. Right. So, okay. So implied in such a position is the insight that Judaism is not identical with philosophy or theology. If it were, we should be moving in a circle. Okay. Well, I was saying naturalization. I was saying intellectually meaningful doesn't mean just it works like a math theorem works. I think meaningful implies a kind of naturalization, isn't this corresponds to things in your lived experience that you recognize as real and valid. So sometimes those are, intellectual concepts. But if you just recycle the intellectual concepts over and over again, eventually they will not quite hit as hard. So he says, Judaism is founded not on ideas, but on certain facts and events. These facts and events do have philosophical, theological, and metaphysical relevance. But the relevance is always a matter of interpretation, and as such, subject to change. Okay, so let's see how this goes. The events themselves having occurred, the facts having entered into history, are, as such, unalterable and irrevocable. What happened, happened, and what is, does exist. Okay, so he says like this. No matter what philosophical school a person may belong, the event of the Exodus from Egypt will not be affected by it. That happened. Whatever metaphysical ideas a person may entertain, the revelation at Sinai remains forever the revelation at Sinai. Even a mitzvah is an event and not an idea. Okay, that means something like, let's say God commands you to take 4 species and wave them on the festival of Sukkot. So that means you physically have to take those plants, hold them together, and give them a shake. That's the mitzvah. It's not. It can be enhanced by understanding such a thing on a deep spiritual level, but the mitzvah isn't to understand on a deep spiritual level. The mitzvah, the religion of Judaism, is you have to go and do the mitzvah in actuality. All right, so here we go. If we wished to list the events which, because of their centrality, might be considered the constants of Judaism, we might well make use of the traditional formula Kudsha B'richu Yisrael V'Araisa, God, Israel, and the Torah. In the context of Judaism, these three terms stand for historic events. God in the Bible is not an idea. This is pure Berkovits, by the way. He is the living God who addresses himself to people, who revealed himself to Israel, and who acts in history and is known by men by the events of his manifestations. Think of the encounter in the thought of Eliezer Berkovits. The prophets encountered God. That event is the primary fact. The task of a Jewish theology is to interpret the intelligible and conceptual implications of the events in which the living God makes himself known to men. So it is with the Torah. The Torah is not just a very clever book containing a great store of wisdom. It is the word of God addressed to Israel. This is its essential nature. As such, the Torah is a fact, a historic event that happened between God and Israel. In this connection, the Jewish people, too, should be understood in its dynamic, eventful stance in history as the people who is actually addressed by God and whose existence evolves under the impact of the Word. Right? Looks like Jewish history is very different once we start celebrating the holiday of Passover. Like there's an original Passover where events in history happen to us. That's the Exodus from Egypt. And then the Jewish people, there are all these stories about people who, it was very difficult for them to obtain matzah. So, like they went out in the fields and they harvested wheat and then they chopped wood to fire the ovens for the matzah. And, people did this, in Nazi concentration camps, more than 2,000 years after the original Exodus, because the Jewish people are a part of history. And, we continue to evolve the history of the Jewish people by continuing to live out the commandments in the Torah. We are now in a position to say more clearly how the variables and constants may combine to determine the path of a Jewish thinker. Any interpretation, from whatever foreign source it may originate, that acknowledges God, Israel, and the Torah as historic realities and attempts to provide the metaphysical or theological corollary to the facts and events for which they stand may well be incorporated in a Jewish philosophy. It's fair game. On the other hand, any interpretation that attempts to substitute the idea, the metaphysics, and the philosophy for the historical reality cannot be called Jewish. Okay? So there are a lot of people he could be talking to. I think the primary audience here there are Jews who would say, we'd like to delete God or the Torah, and we'll still have Judaism, we'll still do Jewish philosophy. And Berkovits is saying, no, we're here to do Orthodox Judaism, and you're not allowed to do that. When we read in the Bible, and God spoke to Moses, the phrase raises problems of anthropomorphism. Let's say you believe very strongly in the philosophical arguments about the nature of God and what God cannot be said to do in terms of the via negativa. So just the whole Torah is just filled with God speaking to Moses over and over again. So how are you going to do this? So you could do logos theology. You could adopt the concept of the Memra, of the Dibur Nivra from Onkelos and Rosayagon. You could do the even more rationalistic method of Maimonides. You can explain God speaking to humans in any such ways. I'll kind of insert. Ibn Ezra, commenting on the Ten Commandments, he quotes the wise people of India as saying that, there is a God, but it's impossible for God to communicate with humans. And, Ibn Ezra says, of course, this isn't true. we see in the Torah that's not the case. But, the Chachmei Hodu, in terms of philosophy, there's no flaw in their method. We just happen to have evidence to the contrary. We have historical facts. Maybe we can't explain the facts. Like in physics, when you run an experiment and you don't mess up, which does happen sometimes. I don't know if there was a news article about like CERN was measuring some signal traveling faster than the speed of light. So some people were speculating, well, how could this be quantum whatever? But if you were skeptical about this, you were right, because the answer is they were measuring something wrong. Like if your clocks are wrong when you try to make a measurement, you'll get things. But if you do an experiment properly and you don't have a theory for it, that's fine. You can take time in physics to come up with a theory to explain what's going on. So too with theology. We might build some logical edifice and we say, well, we're not really sure how God spoke to Moses. Okay, that's fine. We know that God spoke to Moses. We know that God spoke to Isaiah, Jeremiah. Actually, Berkovits in God, Man, and History, he just says, like, look, read the book of Jeremiah, read the book of Isaiah, read the book of Ezekiel. It just says, look, either God spoke to these people or God didn't speak to anyone. He says it, man. It's pretty good. So we got to start somewhere. So if one were to maintain that God spoke to Moses only has symbological significance, as perhaps there are reports that in the 13th century in Spain, this kind of rationalism kind of get out of hand. And this is maybe what Ibn Ezra was responding to. Rashba, the student of the Ramban, he may have also been responding to this. But you end up with this logical, philosophical. I don't mean to using that language. I don't mean to say it's like watertight or foolproof. I just mean that people could find it convincing that it has the result that God never communicates with man. And then the meaning of the phrase is that really, the genius of Moses grasped some supreme eternal truth. However absolute irrational dignity one may be prepared to accord to the teachings of Moses, one would be philosophizing outside the realm of Judaism. And you're entitled to do that. Berkovits is saying, if you do that, you can't call yourself a Jewish philosopher. All right, let's go into Philo of Alexandria. And in this case, I believe I'm not giving it away when I say that Berkovits chooses violence. Berkovits might think of himself as much more learned than Philo of Alexandria. For one thing, Berkovits knows the Talmud, and he knows that Philo doesn't. Second of all, he might think, perhaps correctly, that Philo doesn't know the Bible in Hebrew, and Berkovits for sure does. As in, there are many people who think that Philo knew the scriptures through the Greek Septuagint, which served many ancient Jews, I'd say especially outside of the land of Israel, perfectly well for knowledge of the Bible. Similar to, you find many Jews in America who they can read the English Art Scroll, and that is their orthodox understanding of the scriptures. Not everyone knows Hebrew. Some smart people don't know Hebrew. You might be watching this video. You might be a very smart person. You might be very Jewish. You might be a better Jew than me, but you might not know Hebrew, which I would consider unfortunate. I would hope you do. I hope you do, and I think your understanding of things would increase if you went into the Hebrew. So let's praise Philo. Philo the outstanding authorities in the field consider him the originator of theology and mysticism for all monotheistic religions. Philo is up to it. By the way, I think as a project, it would be very cool to go into the logos theology of Philo and figure it out, because I mean he's ground zero for this. For many centuries, he remained unknown in the midst of his own people. Then Jews didn't study Philo. I'll make a very broad statement. There's no Philo quoting in the Talmud. His writings were preserved by Christian theologians. Even though a contemporary of Hillel, so Hillel, one of the most famous and I will say beloved rabbis in the history of Judaism, Philo had to wait until the 16th century to be discovered for Jews. For this, there was a valid reason. All right, let's go into this. His concept of the logos, the mediator between God and creation, was so conceived that it readily lent itself to serve as the metaphysical basis for a central Christian dogma. I mean, is that reason to not like Philo? I mean, like you know, let's say you have a God and creation, just kind of like logically here. So, and if God and creation are on some kind of spectrum, it makes sense there should be, you know, some thing of creation that is like most godly. Who's afraid of that? Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? All right, but let's see. It was a concept which, offered as an interpretation of Judaism, the Jewish consciousness had to ignore. All right, Berkovits. All right. I see you're not into this whole logos thing. But I have to see how Philo treats this, though. But was the path of the man, Philo's own personal predilection with problems of philosophy and metaphysics, Jewish or not? We, as in Berkovits, believe that the answer should be given unhesitatingly in the affirmative. Philo was a Jew. He is living as a Jew in Egypt and Alexandria, and he's trying to work out how this all made sense. Attempting to harmonize the philosophical concept of the absolute, as it was understood in Greek philosophy, with that of the personal God of Judaism, he was led to the concept of the logos. For him, it explained the technique by which the absolute was in contact with the cosmos. The concept itself is purely subjective and as such characteristic of the man Philo. So, I guess what he means is, if you read the Torah, you will not see this. But many interpreters of the Torah will bring in this concept, because in terms of the philosophy that isn't just current in their times, but makes sense to them. And I want to emphasize kind of like naturalistic. Some things make sense to you in a certain time and place. And if we look at history, there are things that made sense to people even only like 100 years ago or 200 years ago that we find very strange, even incomprehensible. And if you're willing to get a bit subjective about this, you will have to admit that in the beginning of the 21st century, we have many beliefs that people of the future are going to think are very strange. You have to admit that. They will not seem natural to people of the future. So the concept, understood by Philo, belongs in the realm of Jewish philosophy, because with its help, the thinker was attempting to give expression to the intellectual significance of the events expressed by God, Israel, and the Torah. So this short list of what's going on, God, Israel, and Torah, there are two ways of getting at that. Actually, one is the philosophical tradition. I think Rabbi Chelbo and the Sefer Ikarim. Maimonides has 13 principles of faith. I think Sefer Ikarim boils it down for you. He's like, look, as long as you've got God, Israel, and the Torah, you can take those different directions, but it's basically Judaism. And the other way to get God, Israel, and the Torah is in the Zohar, which maybe either was influenced by Rabbi Chelbo or influenced Rabbi Chelbo, with the statement that God, Israel, and the Torah are one. We are united. Cannot be separated, let us say. So, all right, so let's see. A great deal of the criticism to which Abraham ibn Dawid subjected Gabriel to was justified. One may rightly say that Neoplatonism, the philosophical system adopted by Gabriel, is not only foreign but antithetical to Judaism. Emanation is the opposite of creation. The absolute one negates the concept of the living God revealing himself to man. For some reason or another, Neoplatonism appealed to Ibn Gabriel. He made it his own metaphysics. However, we are not really in a position to judge his full personal philosophy, partially because at the end of his book, Makor Chaim, he said, I'm going to explain this all in the next volume. And we don't possess that volume. Things like many books in Jewish history was lost to time. So between the one and this world, he interposed the Ritzon Hashem. This is actually very, very common and important for understanding. So we have the absolute one, and then we have this created world. So what's in between? Well, let's put the Ritzon Hashem, the will of God. We'll say, kind of like the voluntaristic principle. God chose to create the world. God created the world in the way that God desired to. So by using this classical term of Judaism, Gabriel replaced the Neoplatonic one with the God of his fathers. By introducing the idea of the will of God, he made room for the concept of creation beside that of emanation. One might very well say this is poor metaphysics. The grafting of the will of God onto the trunk of Neoplatonism is perhaps a metaphysical monstrosity. Poor Plotinus. The entire emanation theory was conceived in order to eliminate the need for a divine will, which could not be harmonized with the idea of the absolute one. How did this metaphysical monster, a hybrid between emanation and creation, come about? It's criticizing the concept of the Ritzon Hashem on philosophical grounds, saying this does not align very well with Aristotle. So if your primary motivation was to align with Aristotle, this would be some kind of failure. But if your goal was to do some kind of Judaism, some kind of real religion, this is actually quite excellent. Neoplatonism assumed the function of the variable in Ibn Gabriel's philosophy, but they were also the constants of Judaism. And then Spinoza is the opposite example. Spinoza has the absolute one, and Spinoza eliminates the dynamic element and says the cosmos is the one, as in reality is God. That's kind of the Spinoza for one sentence. I don't want to say Spinoza for dummies. There's only the one, the infinite substance, and whatever exists is either attribute or mode of the infinite. So so for Spinoza, everything happens for a reason, and everything is due to God. But just God is like a rock and a tree, and everything that we see in the universe, and nothing spiritual beyond that we can't see. That's the heresy part. Because the system knows only God and nothing else besides him, it is not Jewish. Okay, so you can have a God that is everywhere and is in everything, but you need to have things that aren't God, like Judaism or Jews, and the Torah. The constants of Judaism have no place within such a creation. The concepts of the divine will, of revelation, of a living God making himself known to men are not tolerated by Spinoza. I mean, Spinoza says a miracle can't happen. God's will, or things like gravity and the seasons, and it would be a violation of the will of God to vary these regular patterns and cycles. That's the way Spinoza puts it. Sounds very religious. The less religious way to say stuff that's physically impossible can't happen. So most religious people say stuff that can't happen can happen whenever it's the will of God. Yep. So within the system of Spinoza, there's no room for history, no room for historic events of God communicating to anyone. And so, therefore, Berkovits says, his is not only a non-Jewish, but an anti-Jewish philosophy. And then he says, in terms of the Kabbalah, you see a lot of similarity between this Platonism stuff. But the Kabbalistic writers, they make use of such ideas in order to render the historic facts on which Judaism is based, God, Israel, and Torah, to make it more meaningful and more challenging for the individual Jew. The result is a more intimate personal commitment to the living God, his word, and his people. So you can say, take Chabad or the Kabbalah of the Arizal, and you put it through people, and you end up with really good Jews. Like these people, they know the Torah, they do the Torah. The results are good. They find it very meaningful. So Berkovits might say, well, this doesn't do it for me, but I can't really complain. I can't say this isn't Jewish. It makes better Jews. All right, part 4. The subjective factor between every Jewish philosophy and the permanent facets of religious life we have thus been able to indicate. So Kant warned against the transcendental usage of reason, but he still believed that its conclusions had absolute validity. Okay, so is that possible, that the human mind is capable of grasping the absolute? No. Human mind is incapable of grasping the absolute. What is affirmed by human reason cannot have absolute validity. Berkovits says, look, your logic, your logical brain, is not tall enough to ride. Whatever logical necessity a judgment may have, it will be the logical necessity as comprehended by the finite intellect of a human being. Applying these insights to the theological field, one might say with even greater conviction that one can speak of divine truth only rhetorically. No divine truth has ever been conceived by a human mind. If God wanted to communicate such a truth to man, he would have to first transform the finite human intellect into a divine one. Well, people say things like, if I wanted to understand God, I'd have to be God. So, we're here using our human minds and human concepts and human ways of relating to things that we can't understand. Sometimes with the understanding that we can't understand. And that's fine. That's how we function. That's what we have to do. That's the job. The job isn't to do the impossible, although it might involve yearning for the impossible. The insight to which the teachers of the Midrash and Talmud drew our attention. Of the revelation at Sinai, they said the Torah was received, Lefi kocho shel kol echad ve'echad. Everyone got the message according to the limitations of themselves. Okay, and he adds, even Moses received the revelation Lefi kocho according to his personal capacity. This is the meaning of the Talmudic statement that the 50th gate of wisdom remained closed even to Moses. The highest and most authoritative understanding of the Torah is bound to be lacking in absolute validity owing to limitations of our humanity. Yeah, I mean, so you see kind of in the Torah, after the sin of the golden calf, Moses says to God, please reveal to me your ways. And the basic understanding is Moses asked to understand God, and God said, well, I can't do that, but I can give you, a hint. But there's going to be something that you can't understand, even though you're filled with this, desire to understand me. In the absolute sense, that is impossible. And let's see. So even with the understanding that Moses, let's say, was a highly perfected human intellect, or even the most perfect human intellect, there are things we can't do. That is definitely how Berkovits is interpreting the Talmud here. Okay. All right. So, in Moreh Nevuchim, Guide to the Perplexed, Maimonides had to wrestle with Hashgacha, or divine providence. On the basis of Aristotelian metaphysics, providence could not be associated with God. God doesn't, to use the God of the philosophers doesn't care about what happens down here. We're pretty irrelevant to absolute philosophical truth. We're just, contingent whatever playing out. Very, very silly stuff. Now, if you have a scientific perspective, if you like observing experiments, then actually contingencies are very interesting. But Aristotle was not a scientist. He didn't like observing how experiments played out. And so people who followed Aristotle did not discover certain facts about the physical world, or they weren't interested in things like, how does gravity pull on objects, etc., etc. So the God of religion, Judaism, is a bit more scientific, as in interested in how these experiments are playing out and what's going on in this world than, the way that Aristotle conceived of the absolute. You can view the Torah or history as a kind of like moral experiment that God keeps trying to run. That's kind of at least how I understand the book of Genesis, book of Exodus, and actually all the biblical history that follows after that. As in, we're trying to create, good people, a good society, and playing with the variables. Sometimes you have more success than others. The supreme form thinks only that which is most noble, i.e. the supreme form itself. That's Aristotle. But what is God without Hashgacha? That's what Berkovits says. God has to care about and know about what is going on in the world. So Maimonides solves the problem in a manner adequate for himself. So he modifies Aristotelianism. And this is kind of how Maimonides approaches. We have kind of an Aristotle or Arabic Aristotelian approach. And then we modify it when it becomes incompatible with what we feel is like the core of Judaism. The constants of Judaism were also the determining factor in Hasdai Crescas's criticism of Aristotle, and in Crescas's turning away from both Maimonides and Gersonides. The conflict with the irreducible facts served for him the incentive to seek a different approach for himself. The elements of constancy in Judaism are not only control and limit the philosopher, they influence and guide him. The intensity of the orientation of the variable and the subjective elements towards the constants determines the quality of Jewishness in philosophy. So I have Crescas's book, or Adonai. I have it. So at the beginning is very interesting. I actually translated and put this up on Sefaria. people have been able to use this. But basically, he starts off really with a bang. And he says, Maimonides lists one of the commandments to believe in God. And in short, Grescus just argues logically, how can there be a commandment to believe in God? There's no such thing as a commandment without a commander. Okay, so if I am ignorant of the existence of someone commanding me, that person cannot give me a commandment. So Grescus argues it's illogical and can't be that one of the 613 mitzvot is a command to believe in God. Belief in God has to predate the 613 mitzvot. And if you want to get a sense of maybe how how to defend the Rambam, you could say something like this. You could say, yes, belief in God predates the mitzvah. But what if the mitzvah to know about God isn't like a one-time thing or a checkbox? What if that mitzvah is to have a constant awareness of God? And that actually you will find in Shulchan Aruch, in the very beginning, in the Ramah, where he cites the Rambam saying you have to be constantly aware of God. Or in the language of Shulchan Aruch itself, Shiviti Adonai lenegdi tamid. You must always have an awareness of the divine. So you could know that there is a commander, and one of the commandments could be to maintain a constant awareness of the one giving the commandments. Constant awareness of the divine. The ultimate need for Jewish philosophy is a religious one. Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon, in defining the purpose of his Emunot Videot, says he undertakes the inquiry so that what we have learned from the prophets of God as a matter of belief may be clarified for us in actuality. So what Sadia Gaon has in mind is to embrace by an act of intellectual penetration what has originally come to us on the authority of divine revelation. What a man holds to be true on the authority of tradition alone, though having its source in revelation, he owns passively. It is imposed upon him, as it were, from without. If he wants to make it his very own, he must acquire it by some vital intellectual effort. One way or the other, he must be able to clarify it for himself, bifoal, as Rav Sadia Gaon says, i.e., in the actuality of his own personal life and understanding. In modern terms, this is what we call naturalization. It has to make sense to you in a natural way, not reaching for some thing or, oh, okay, this great authority said it, I submit to that great authority. That would be a necessary start. But the process is, well, eventually it has to make sense to you. And there's the goal is for things to make sense. And it might be we have to wait until the Messianic era for everything to make sense to everyone at all times. So the good news is it's coming. It's going to happen. But maybe we can get, a sense of what that's like, kind of like a preview before that occurs. Everything is going to make sense. Trust the process. But in the here and now, we can get there. So he says this is a requirement of religious life. If the intellect has no share, so he says the intellect. When I say naturalization, or like what feels like right and true, it's, the intellect is important. It wouldn't want contradicting intellect, but I'm thinking a little deeper. I don't think I'm disagreeing with Berkovits, but let's see. If the intellect has no share in one's religious affirmation, one cannot be involved in them with the wholeness of one's humanity. Objectivity may be the goal of scientific inquiry. Subjective commitment is the very essence of religious life. The deeper the involvement of the personal element in one's philosophy of Judaism, the more religiously meaningful the affirmations and the more real the commitment to which they lead. Okay? So everyone can only hear God lefi kocho, according to what you can intellectually sustain in your brain. And that's actually the goal of things. But only if you absorb the objective meaning of the constants of Judaism, God, the Torah, and the Jews, the Jewish people, assimilating it and making it part of the most intimately individualistic aspect of his being, will such meaning become for him a significant pointer to the eternal. For the sake of the sincerity of its Jewish affirmations and the wholeness of its religious commitment, each generation needs its Jewish philosophy validated in the light of Judaism. To be sure, the philosophy itself may become outdated, yet as long as it did point in the direction of the eternal for even a single soul, it deserves the attention of all those who seek to interpret for themselves meaningfully the irreducible religious realities of Judaism. As in, if we study something that worked for people in the 13th century, that's meaningful. Because we see, okay, this pointed them towards God. We live in a different time. Maybe we need different concepts. Maybe we can create those concepts. But we understand the goal. We can learn from history. The writing on the pointers may become faded and vague, hardly legible, and no longer quite convincing. So let's say you read that 13th century religious work and you're like, this doesn't really do it for me. As long as they ever oriented a searching mind towards eternity, they remain pointers for all of us. That's how he ends it. Eliezer Berkovits. So what is Jewish philosophy? Jewish philosophy for Berkovits is A, within our current subjective time, making sense of God, Torah, and the Jewish people. And 2, in a more like historical sense, recognizing in the past previous systems that have tried to make sense of God, the Torah, and the Jewish people. And so with this wide net, we can include a lot of things. We have to exclude some things, like Spinoza, as saying, okay, this is brilliant philosophy done by a Jew, but it's not Jewish philosophy. And that's where we stand. So this channel is called Talmudic Theology. Trying to see if we can base a theology on good old Talmudic Judaism. And Berkovits says you have to do this in every day and age. Okay?